All right, so continuing our morning presentations, we had Curt playing the role of good cop, explaining the process, and now we have our resident Institute bad cop. So Martin's going to give it to us with no sugarcoating and all the brutality that the subject deserves. So may I introduce another fellow in the Natural Law Institute, Martin Steppen.
Thank you. Well, so what actually happened here is that I'm covering exactly the same topic Curt just covered. So if you get tired of hearing that, just boo me off the stage. Otherwise, short introduction. I thought of myself as a free thinker in my youth, as does everyone after all. And in fact, I was a basic lefty. And that led into a collapse of my dearest relationships. I had the dark night of the soul. And what I didn't realize then, I started thinking for the first time ever. And running into Curt's work accelerated that process, and I hope I can return some of that value now.
We love you, Martin.
Now, verbally, I'm more of the Keanu Reeves type, so I need a script.
You a script?
Yeah.
Are you the one?
I am A1. So, in this presentation, I aim to introduce concepts that will be relevant throughout the rest of the conference, except they've already been introduced. But human nature is something conservatives appeal to, but there isn't much effort to describe it beyond calling it fallen due to their Christian beliefs. That view is fundamentally more correct than the utopian one of the left. It still makes the same error, that human nature could have ever been more perfect than it is. Human nature is extremely well adapted for the circumstances we've lived through for past hundreds of thousands of years, as evidenced by us still being here. And it's rather silly to complain that what we needed to be to survive as a species doesn't correspond to some ideological ideals. So what is a man? A featherless biped? A rational animal? A miserable pile of secrets? This may all be true, but since we want to be precise and we are really interested in how people perceive, think, and act here, we must talk about why we have that squishy thing in our skulls and what is it doing. Without getting into the detailed neurology, its whole purpose is to recognize patterns in information coming in through the senses and already stored information as memories. These patterns are effectively predictions. I'm sure you're all familiar with Pavlov's experiment where he'd get his dogs to associate the ringing of a bell with receiving food. Their brains detected the pattern, and whenever their senses received part of the pattern, ringing of the bell, they predicted the rest. This is what's happening all the way down to the simplest patterns. If I clap, I was going to clap here, but I'm holding a microphone. If I clap, you get the independent visual and auditory information, but you recognize it as a single event due to them occurring simultaneously. In fact, everything you see around you are the patterns your brains are predicting from experience based on limited sensory input. On the other hand, a newborn that's getting the raw sensory data cannot yet make any sense of them until he gets enough experience to make the connections, and before then, he's effectively blind. Something that would probably take an extremely high dose of psychedelics to replicate for an adult. Our brains, of course, don't just predict, they also make our bodies act. But it turns out that that's the same thing. To predict a movement of the body is to act it out. In other words, our actions are stored as part of the patterns, as memories. This is the erroneously called muscle memory. Muscles themselves have no means to remember anything. Specifically, our brains are predicting opportunities for acquisition, and because there are many at any given moment, they select for greatest return in shortest time with least effort, greatest certainty, and lowest risk. Acquisition here is a relative term and may sometimes only mean defense, preservation, or minimization of losses. This doesn't mean we always get it right. Sometimes we may even knowingly prioritize what's good for us in the short term, when we know it's bad in the long term, such as getting drunk like yesterday, but you get the idea. Different brain regions, of course, specialize in different predictions or outputs, but that is beyond the scope of this presentation. We have enough on our plate as it is. This is where what we have in common ends, however, and while we tend to project our minds onto people around us by default, there are quite radical differences in how different people model the world, what's salient to them, what they perceive as opportunities to act on, threats to be avoided, what kind of connections they tend to or are even able to make. That is what the meat of this presentation will be about. The first major difference is neoteny or juvenilization, which means slower development and results in retention of childlike traits in adulthood. This doesn't sound like an obviously good thing, but compared to other apes, we retain a large globular head, thin skull, and flat broad face, giving us space for large brains. We further get a relatively hairless body, other than on the top of the head. Well, some of us, some of us not. Larger eyes, small nose, jaws and teeth, and shape of our ears. More importantly, we retain much more plasticity in behavior for longer and to some extent our whole life, whereas other animals only learn new behavior while young. The differences in neoteny between human populations are best observed on the level of what used to be called race, before we were told that race doesn't exist and we are all the same. We see differences in skull size, slanted forehead, length of pregnancy, rate of maturation, duration of plasticity, average length of life, self-regulation, and even aggression. At the high extreme, you have Asians, who mature the slowest and tend to live longest. At the low extreme, you have African pygmies, who, along with other unique traits compared to most of humanity, such as their size, are sexually mature at 10 years old. You can see the notion of equality the current regime uses to justify itself is already breaking down here, because it's clearly absurd to put different populations with different rate of maturity and aggression into the same schools at the same age. Next, intelligence. Intelligence is an ability to solve problems and solve them quickly. Physiologically, it's dependent on two main things. First is simply having a larger brain, where the neoteny contributes, allowing space for more neurons. The second is connectivity, or distance and speed at which connections can be made. Contrary to claims of multiple intelligences, there is just one and improves everything that involves neurons. And it's best measured by the simplest tests, such as speed of reactions or color discrimination. We tend to measure it via IQ tests, which are imperfect because that score is improved by basic nutrition, basic education, and training for the tests, but it's often the best measurement we have available. Intelligence itself appears to be almost completely genetic, with the rest possibly attributable to fetal development in utero. The differences are extremely consequential, as the table demonstrates. You can see that for people with IQ in the 80s and below, it's impossible to participate in the modern civilization and get employment, or even understand a hypothetical such as how they'd feel if they didn't have breakfast. 90 can follow written instructions and operate simple machines. 100 can learn from written instructions without having to experience the work firsthand. 105 can repair simple machines and articulate their own ideas, all the way up to 140 and above, where discovery and invention happens. These things obviously matter on an individual level, but they're even more consequential on a collective level. While having one less point for an individual is completely irrelevant, one less average point on a societal scale means everything works slightly worse, everything is less reliable, people become both less trusting and trustworthy. Consequence of 10 points difference then means you're in a completely different country. And as with neoteny, different demographics have radically different distributions of intelligence, and you probably already know or can guess what those are, given outcomes in different countries.
I heard Czechs were the most smart people in Europe.
You heard right. And finally, what's most relevant for the topic of this conference, sex differences in cognition. They aren't literally sex differences in the sense of being inherent trait of the corresponding sexes, rather it's a spectrum where a typical woman is closer to the feminine end and a typical man is closer to the masculine end, because that is what our evolutionary niches demanded for much of our history and what they got rewarded for with reproductive success. But that doesn't mean we won't see outliers on both sides or even demographics where cognition of a typical male or female are completely shifted because their environment had different demands and rewarded different strategies. Overall, it appears there's a lot more feminine men around than masculine women, however. People that are much closer to the extreme than normal are dysfunctional, borderline personality on the feminine end and autism on the masculine. Physiologically, it consists of three main aspects: dominance of left or right hemisphere, amounts of gray and white matter, and density of lateral and longitudinal connections, meaning either between hemisphere or front to back within them, and hormonal differences, primarily estrogen and testosterone. This has many consequences that we will now examine. I'm writing this with an expectation of the conference being a sausage fest. Of course it is. So most of us probably get the masculine side, but if any of you had at any point in life had a girlfriend, wife, daughter, sister, or a mother, you may be able to confirm the feminine side. Prioritizing prey response means higher neuroticism, flight or freeze response to threats, and avoidance of risky situations that would produce those threats in the first place, including social conflicts, which manifests as higher agreeableness. Predator response means lower neuroticism, fight response to threats, willingness to seek out risky opportunities for higher gains, as well as willingness to engage in competition and conflict to acquire and defend interests, which produces higher disagreeableness. At scale, this means feminine people operate as herds where safety is obtained in numbers, conformity is expected, and their threat is getting ostracized and left behind, which has meant death in much of history. They'll organize as nominally equal, but with constant covert competition going on underneath, with an effort expended more to keep others down at the same or below one's level than at raising oneself up. More on that later. Masculine people operate as packs, where safety is obtained by cooperation and mutual insurance, loyalty and reciprocity are expected, and threat is violent punishment, possibly death. They'll organize into hierarchy and compete overtly for positions in it. In terms of perception, the feminine are empathizing, which, contrary to the common use of the word, doesn't refer to being kind, merciful, or otherwise nice. It only refers to intuitively perceiving face expressions, body language, or tone of voice, and modeling emotions and social relations from that information. They can tell feelings of people towards each other, relative status of people in the group, how much experience someone has interacting with people, how ambitious someone is, and so on. None of this is foolproof. People have learned how this perception works and how to game it. Most obviously pick-up artists, but most of the time the information is highly accurate. What's done with that information is a completely separate matter. It is, however, limited to the present, and ability to consider any long-term consequences is lacking, as is any thinking at scale where higher numbers of people are concerned. The idea of identifiable types of people existing with specific traits, and each of those types having a distribution with mean and outliers, is completely alien to feminine mind. The best it can handle is clear distinction between good and bad people. Thus, the feminine mind is prone to Axalt fallacy, meaning all X are like that, or knocks out whenever trying to defend a group that's, quote, according to prevailing narrative. Further, the feminine model language and are much more skillful with it than the masculine. However, unlike the masculine, they don't transfer information in the literal content of words, rather it's all signaling, or have emotional valence meant to change how the person on the receiving end feels about a given subject. The masculine, on the other hand, model physical world and system. This means they can intuit how objects in space relate to one another, how they interact, and how a system of such interacting parts will evolve over time. The systematizing isn't limited to physical world, but can also manifest as modeling how people themselves work, like what I'm doing here right now, or modeling how a society will over time, given specific trends and incentives, which is what much of our work consists of, and is also a reason why every man thinks about Rome and its collapse. Masculine use of language is much more straightforward than feminine. Tell the truth, provide explanation, negotiate, give promise. Words are actual measurements of the outside world and event in it. We also see differences in the way the two sexes complain about each other. Women complain that men objectify persons, particularly them, and personal statements, and men complain that women personalize the objective, such as taking general statements about women as personal insults. Likewise, you can see women using their verbal abilities to ask for directions, whereas men want to drive based on their spatial model, regardless of whether that model is correct or not. The point here isn't to deride either mode of cognition and communication. They both have their purpose, and we're paying dearly for not learning to understand and to some extent apply both. This is observed even in infants. Small girls pay attention to faces and boys to objects, and it translates into how the feminine and masculine practice acquisition. The former manipulates minds, the latter manipulates physical objects. In terms of capital, feminine will seek to first acquire attention. There is no manipulation of minds possible without first having their attention, and even negative attention is preferable to no attention. For actual women, this comes most easily via their bodies, particularly if they're attractive, a trait which they naturally seek to increase, but otherwise it takes social connections, networks, and prestige. All of this can then be utilized for influence. You'll see women on Instagram explicitly identifying as influencers. Feminine to try to develop skills that help them acquire and utilize all of these. In contrast, the masculine will seek to increase their agency by increasing their self-control, strength, agility, and endurance, skills for transforming nature into materials, transformation and combination of materials into consumables or other useful objects, mimic self, other people or things around, and finally use of violence, whether for defense or offense. Other forms of thought capital will then be tools that increase all of these abilities beyond what can be done with one's own body, loyalty to other people that will cooperate on these things, and territory where to do so. For both feminine and masculine, money will be a useful form of capital as it's a universal means of exchange that can be used to attain all the other things and can likewise be obtained by application of their own skills. And once again, we are paying dearly when we specialize only where our biases lead us. Men eventually find out that they must look good, signal their status and make connections too. Likewise, women sometimes find out being able to do basic work or drive a car can make them a lot more valuable to a potential mate. Before getting into strategies, I need to explain justificationary and falsificationary modes of thinking. Justifying effectively means our brains automatically make connections that maintain our self-image of good and innocent people, and rationalize our actions that were or will only be performed based on our immediate desires. Plausible deniability for any wrong done is always preserved, responsibility evaded, other people blamed, victim status maintained. They'll always tell you what happened to them, but they'll never tell you why. This further manifests as agreeableness, where required opinions for the so-called polite society are rationalized as true, and those that deviate from it as false without actual truth content ever being examined. Accounting is done very selectively. On the other hand, falsificationary thinking involves examination of these internal justifications, consideration of how they could be wrong, how one could be led astray by his own emotions and thoughts, producing self-reflection, responsibility and honesty, as well as disagreeableness when it's applied to justifications voiced by others. Accounting is performed exhaustively. Both scale with intelligence, which is to say it can enable you to see through nonsense justifications, whether your own or someone else's, more easily, but it can likewise enable you to make more elaborate justifications. Justificationary mode of thinking isn't so much feminine as it is the default for every individual. We're all probably a falsificationary bunch here, but if you're anything like me, you've experienced a justificationary phase in your youth. However, it does seem to be the case that feminine minds have a much harder time switching to falsificationary mode, partly because they're more influenced both by their emotions and because they need the social approval. There is, however, another clear reason why actual women can stick with justifying throughout their lives, and that is that they are rewarded for it, or in any case never punished. There is always enough members of both sexes willing to take their justifications at face value, especially if they follow social consensus. Men historically tended to beat justifications and irresponsibility out of each other. And while this is rarely the case today, they still tend to figure out at some point that irresponsibility will get them nowhere in life, and that nothing repulses women as much as being agreeable to them. Now, specific strategies that people get what they want from other people aside. Now, specific strategies that people get what they want from other people aside from neutral exchange of value. For feminine, it's the aforementioned manipulation, which is also more often than not an external expression of justificationary mode of thinking. This includes fail healing, which is sedation by psychological relief without solving problems, overloading, which is distracting by providing more information or misinformation than recipient can make sense of, obscurantism and suggestion. These things can unintuitively often be desirable because a lot of people, should they just keep hearing the truth about themselves, about other people, and the world around them would likely go crazy and go on a rampage. The primary purpose appears to be managing children. Next, there's seduction, which is not in itself an issue if it's delivered on, but it's also possible to seduce someone into doing something for you with a false promise that won't or can be delivered on, or to seduce into a hazard that would either never be agreed to if the consequences were understood, or appeal to high time preference at the cost of what's good for the individual in the long run. Then there are feminine means of coercion, what we used to call GSRRM, an acronym for gossiping, shaming, rallying, ridicule, and moralizing. We don't use it so much nowadays because the list of identified strategies has since grown to the point it fills most of the slides. There's now disapproval, denial, psychologizing, outraging, undermining, propagandizing, shouting down, silencing, canceling, deplatforming, reputation destruction, doxing, and institutional abuse or threat of any of these. Combining this with their evasion of responsibility, they can outright cry out in pain as they strike you. If you want to learn how to detect and deal with these strategies, buy Na's book in the back. In contrast, masculine coercive strategy is just violence or threat of thereof. The masculine can, of course, try to lie to get what they want, but it's much harder because they don't believe their own lies. Keep in mind, these strategies on both sides are in themselves amoral. What makes them moral or immoral is only who they're used on. That is, it's immoral to use them on in-group members who do no wrong, but moral to use them on enemies or to punish and correct the behavior of misbehaving in-group members. We've already mentioned how attitude to responsibility is affected. The feminine will try to evade responsibility wherever possible, because being responsible for something creates potential conflict with anyone holding them accountable, or anyone with designs on the same thing that they're responsible for. Feminine will not choose responsibility as long as irresponsible options remain available. Masculine, on the other hand, is much more willing to take on responsibility provided it comes with authority over that which they're responsible over, or in any case, when that responsibility is appropriately rewarded. Such options are increasingly limited today. Men are expected to take on responsibility without authority, such as within their families, and responsibility within normal job is less rewarded than ever, with men left feeling like useful idiots if they do more than the minimum expected work. This translates into attitude towards relationship as well. All relationships are transactional, but where masculine approach them with reciprocity and are loyal because of the sense of debt that must be repaid, feminine view relationship in terms of what they provide in the present and will readily discard them when better opportunities offering access to higher status people, more influence, or simply more material satisfaction emerge. Differences in perception in time versus overtime and in responsibility then lead to feminine being consumptive and destructive, and masculine being productive and capitalizing, though to be fair, this has a mirror image in masculine disagreeableness and willingness to engage in conflict being potentially destructive of feminine social capital. We further make a distinction between feminine being adapted to familial and social scale and masculine to economic and political scale, but this may paint an inaccurate picture. Masculine element within family and society is needed so that there's someone who can bear and teach responsibility, and families and societies are stronger for this. On the other hand, the feminine is extremely well adapted to politics, wherever networking and manipulation achieve political goals, not so well adapted, where it takes negotiation and loyalty. Furthermore, where masculine are involved in politics for the interests of their tribe, the feminine are in it out of self-interest and will only act in the interest of the tribe where incentives are aligned. Now we move on to a brief introduction to the concept of a group strategy. If you recall me introducing the concept of stable relation at last conference or get it elsewhere in our work, group strategy is how group organizes into such a relation that can survive challenges of its environment and persist over time. Environments differ in geography, climate, available resources, competitors, and various other potential benefits and challenges. The group has its own capital of distribution of different genetic traits, which we just went over, which limits possible options for the members along the distribution, as well as group as a whole. The group then must be and will be organized to deal with all these conditions via three possible means of coercion: masculine, which is military and state for defense and force; feminine, which is religion, at least of the Middle Eastern kind we're most familiar with for better or worse; and law, which is technically neutral but still relies on masculine systematizing and sense of responsibility towards the whole group and towards an abstract concept of justice, if it's not to turn into an enforcement of religion, favoritism, and power tripping. Different groups develop these in different order, and sometimes don't even develop all of them or any. This is the most significant but not the only reason they then further develop different military strategy, economic strategy, social classes, different norms of relations between them, roles for the sexes and relations between them, family structure, relations between the young and the old, rules of inheritance, different perceptions of outsiders and ways of relating to them, such as trading with them, enslaving them, exterminating them, or parasitizing on them. Different ways of deciding who has authority over what, and even completely different attitude towards truth and sense of right and wrong. Do note that the people are almost never aware of this. To them it's completely obvious that this is just how life is lived, and alternatives are unimaginable, just like a fish is unaware of the water it swims in. And so it's not so much that you have a group strategy, the group strategy has you. They further produce stories known as mythos, which perhaps not obvious to Westerners include their history. Mythos teaches people who they are, what's their proper path in life, what's moral and immoral conduct, how to resolve conflicts, how to form families and raise children. All these things and many more are usually contained within. History works the same way. There may have been a real set of events, but the retelling of them, of motivations of the actors, of benefits or costs, their actions brought to themselves and their group, all these are subject to interpretation and ultimately function the same as any other story. Same role is served by wisdom literature or philosophy that teaches by rationalization and argument what stories teach through imitation. These can also serve as political formulae, justifying a particular regime and particular people in positions of power, especially if they're recent enough. Civilizations produce institutions that advance these myths and philosophy to the next generation via culture, which, probably again not obvious to Westerners, is synonymous with religion and education. At least in the West, our schools have always included dominant religion of the time and place alongside technical subjects, though these were far too often subversive ideologies, while European group strategy has to persist outside of academia. The result of all these differences is how the civilization interacts with the rest of the world, whether it adapts, copies others, stagnates or declines and collapses, often several of these in a sequence or cycle. Some examples. China had favorable conditions for centralization and thus first developed state, specifically a meritocratic bureaucracy, didn't really preserve a religion in the sense that we understand it with any sort of gods or supernaturalisms, but rather relies on wisdom literature composed by their four masters, Sun Tzu, Lao Tzu, Kongzu, known in the West as Confucius, and Menzu. Chinese don't have a high regard for human life, which alongside their meritocracy turned out to have a eugenic effect, where people who weren't intelligent or hardworking enough to survive simply didn't, because nobody would take care of them. And today, Chinese remained among the most intelligent populations in the world. Chinese are very agreeable despite otherwise demonstrating masculine condition. They emphasize harmony and in cases of potential conflict try to save face and likewise consider it polite to let others save face. And this is perhaps the reason why they didn't feel the need to develop institution of law, relying on top-down commands. Along with the collectivism, communism made much more sense there than it ever did in the West. But even there ended up being just a labor for what's today an obviously fascist system, as not even Chinese could make real communism work. China has been stagnant throughout history as there was no need to adapt to changing conditions other than occasional barbarian invasion, and this was simply resolved by walling themselves off. Insofar there were Chinese explorers discovering other parts of the world, China has done its best to wipe these out of their history. Its intelligent population has, however, proven more than capable of copying what the other civilizations are doing when the need to adapt became undeniable. Indian civilization emerged through the conquest of primitive Dravidian population by Indo-Europeans who, being heavily outnumbered, put in caste system as a desperate measure to stop mongrelization, effectively isolating 4 distinct gene pools, 5 if you include untouchables, that even today show different levels of admixture with Brahmins, most Indo-European. India developed religion as the first institution that then still bore the clear marks of Indo-European martial ethics. It prescribed the 4 caste different dharma, a correct path in life to follow, and got enshrined in the 4 Vedas, Upanishads, 2 epics, and various secondary texts. But over time, the martial ethic disappeared, and modern Hinduism is something quite different. India never developed a strong centralized state, was subject to frequent conquests, and never managed to develop rule of law either. Its current state and rule of law are both product of the British. Unfortunately, the caste system wasn't foolproof, and over the few thousand years leaked through, such that the whole population declined, and the system has now been abolished entirely to get the approval of the modern West. This is further exasperated by their most intelligent leaving and colonizing the West instead of helping by investing in their country. The West, meaning European civilization, did a much better job of preserving the martial ethic of the Indo-European steppe raiders who invaded Europe, killed the men already living there and kept the women, becoming ancestors of modern Europeans. Steppe raiders, being small warrior bands constantly on the move, basically land pirates, couldn't centralize and developed law to be able to negotiate and resolve conflicts between each other, along with democracy of the investment, not the democracy of everyone. That's obviously a stupid idea. European men, being part of warrior bands and later armies, developed the norm of accurate testimony regardless of effects on face, harmony or status hierarchy. Us trying to preserve any of these at the cost of truth could cost everyone their lives. Due to Europe being covered by forests and not having anything like a fertile river valley, centralization remained impossible until emergence of the Roman Republic, later turned empire, where the institution of state was perfected, but this still found management of distant territories very costly and started losing them as it declined. And while our ancestors always had polytheistic religious belief of some sort, even back on the steppe, as did the other old populations of Europe, religion only truly became a coercive institution at scale with the advent of Christianity, itself evolving out of Platonism and foreign influence at a time when philosophies like Platonism, Epicureanism, and Stoicism already displaced old religion in the Greco-Roman civilization. Our rule of law, specifically adversarial discovery of truth, has eventually been applied to the external world as science, and this, along with our decentralization and internal competition, made us the most adaptive civilization that has ever existed. Well, this is it from me now. You should now be able to understand why it's so impossible to see eye to eye and communicate with people that are different from you. And that is because, in a sense, it is true that we live in a simulation, the one that our brains produce from the very real external world. And that different people, due to different genetic traits, training, experiences, incentives, and cultural and religious heritage, produce a simulation of a completely different world in their minds, even when exposed to exactly the same information. Thank you.